So, a new war has kicked off in the Middle East, but frankly, the reasons we're being given for it seem to be changing by the day. In this explainer, we're going to deconstruct all those shifting justifications for the war with Iran based on a recent analysis from the podcast Pod Save America.
Okay, so everything kicked off on Saturday. It started with US and Israeli airstrikes hitting Iran's military capabilities and its leadership, and the response was swift. Iran and its proxies have already fired back, launching retaliatory strikes across at least 10 other countries. So yeah, this thing got really big really fast. And of course, there is an immediate and tragic human cost. The source we're looking at reports that 6 American troops have already been killed in action. On top of that, at least 18 others have been seriously wounded in these retaliatory strikes. So how did President Trump react to the news of American deaths? Well, it wasn't in a live press conference. Instead, his first comments came from a pre-taped video message that was released from his golf club on Sunday.
So that brings us to the big question. What is the administration's official justification for this conflict? Well, the first public explanation came during a Pentagon press conference held by an official named Pete Hegseth. Hegseth came out and framed this whole thing not as a war of choice, but as finishing something that had already begun. He also made a point to say it wasn't a regime change war, which is an interesting choice of words given the reports that Iran's supreme leader had been killed. But here's where things got a little confusing right from that very same press conference. On the one hand, Hegseth told everyone not to worry about an endless war. But then when he was asked for a timeline, he said he would never hang a time frame on the conflict. So, which is it?
Okay, so the main reason the Pentagon gave us centered on this brand new concept they're calling the conventional umbrella. The theory goes something like this. Iran was on the verge of building up a missile shield so massive that it would effectively make their nuclear program untouchable. Now, the hosts of Pod Save America heard this, and they were not buying it. They pointed out that, hey, the US and Israel have repeatedly struck Iranian targets at will in the past. This whole idea that a conventional missile force could create some kind of magical force field, well, they called it, and I'm quoting here, made-up bullshit. And this raises a central question, right? If the Pentagon's mini justification was already facing this much scrutiny, why did we suddenly start hearing so many different and often contradictory explanations for why this war began?
According to the analysis from our source, that official story began to unravel almost immediately. And what replaced it was this cascade of shifting justifications.
I mean, the explanations were all over the map, and at times they just didn't seem to line up. First, there were these leaks about an imminent Iranian missile attack on the US. Then you get the Pentagon's conventional umbrella theory, and finally Senator Marco Rubio comes out with a completely different story.
So Rubio's argument was that the threat wasn't actually from Iran attacking us first, but from Israel. He claimed Israel was planning an imminent strike, which would then force Iran to retaliate against US forces. In this version of events, the US was basically forced to act because of what Israel was about to do.
However, that whole narrative appeared to be contradicted by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs himself. He went public and stated the U.S. wasn't just reacting. He said the U.S. was a partner in the Israeli strike, providing key intelligence and being, in his words, instrumental to the operation. The source argues this means the so-called imminent threat was actually created by the very military campaign we were starting. And when you look at the timeline for this supposed Iranian ICBM threat, you see that for decades, U.S. intelligence has consistently assessed that Iran is at least a decade away from developing a missile that could hit the U.S. That stands in pretty stark contrast to the recent leaks claiming an attack was imminent.
So, if the official justifications all seem a little inconsistent, what does the source suggest is actually driving this conflict? Let's get into their analysis of the potential underlying motivations.
The podcast hosts point to what they see as a combination of factors. They suggest this conflict is being driven by President Trump's ego, the long-held ambitions of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, a real desire to just tear up the Iran nuclear deal, and a political push from allies like Senator J.D. Vance.
So why does this lack of a single, consistent rationale really matter? Let's turn to the real-world stakes of this conflict, because as laid out by the source, they are incredibly high.
To begin with, public support for this war appears pretty divided, to say the least. A Washington Post poll cited in the source shows that a majority, 52% of Americans, actually oppose the military action, while only 39% are in support. The source also points to what they describe as a totally unsustainable military and economic situation. Think about it. Iran is deploying thousands of these relatively cheap drones, while the US and its allies are using multi-million-dollar missiles to intercept them. This creates a war of attrition, and it raises a really scary question. What runs out first? Iran's cheap drones, or our allies' incredibly expensive interceptors?
And the potential consequences, as outlined by the source, are, well, they're significant. They warn about the risk of spreading chaos across the entire region, a massive new refugee crisis, shocks to the global oil supply, immense costs to taxpayers, and the potential for inspired terrorist attacks, all stemming from a conflict with no clearly stated objective or exit strategy.
And this all leads to a final, thought-provoking point raised by the source. They highlight this kind of arrogance in believing you can actually control events after launching a war. They argue that when you unleash chaos, you are not in charge of all the consequences. Which raises the question, who is?